In the autumn of 1929, the United States did not merely enjoy prosperity. It believed in prosperity. The men who ran the Federal Reserve Bank of New York walked to work under headlines that read like sermons. The country had lived through a decade of dividends, new radios, new cars, new electricity lines stretched across the plains, and a self-image as the only fully functioning adult in a sick ward. In the spring and summer of 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, an index of 30 industrial stocks that few citizens outside New York would have been able to name a decade earlier, closed above 300 for the first time in its history, climbed again, and on the 3rd of September 1929 touched 381.17. Brokers on Broad Street parked Cadillacs outside their offices. Brokers' clerks drove Fords. Elevator operators, messenger boys, soda jerks, stenographers, widows, off-duty firemen. Almost anyone with a margin account and a nervous disposition could, in a matter of weeks, become a player on the great American stage. The economy was, on paper, almost sinfully healthy. Unemployment sat near 4%. Real wages were rising. Inflation was a memory of an older cleaving. The index of industrial production for the second quarter of 1929 sat at a level American economists had not previously predicted would be reached before the late 1930s. And then the window shut. Within a single October, that index lost roughly a third of its value. Within 4 years, real gross national product fell about 30%. Within a decade, 1 in 4 American workers could not find a job. The story almost everyone inherits, the one told in classrooms and one-panel editorial cartoons, and remembered at the family table, is the story of greedy speculators who egged each other on until the music stopped. There is something in that story. There is also something missing. There is something hidden in a hotel ledger, in 200 handwritten letters, in a dinner that very few Americans have ever heard of. That hidden thing is what this essay is about. In the early summer of 1927, a letter crossed the Atlantic. It was handwritten on plain paper, and it carried no official seal. It was sent by a man named Montagu Collett Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, to a man named Benjamin Strong Jr., the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The letter, preserved now in the Strong papers at the Federal Reserve Archive in St. Louis, asked Strong to come to a private meeting at a private resort on the south shore of Long Island. It asked him to come because the gold standard, the supposedly immovable foundation of the world's money, was wobbling. It asked him to come because France, in particular, was hoarding gold in amounts that panicked the British, and because the only institution in the world with enough gold to quiet France was the New York Fed. What Strong could not have known, what no one at that dinner could have known, was that the policy he and Norman agreed to enact in the weeks that followed would, by 1929, pour gasoline on the most spectacular financial blaze in modern history. That the small circle of men who sat down to that single dinner on Long Island that July were choosing, deliberately, to keep interest rates low for the sake of a foreign currency, and that their choice would be remembered by future central bankers, including a Princeton economist named Ben Bernanke delivering a lecture at a small college in Virginia 7 decades later, as the hinge on which the entire 20th century turned. Why did the most powerful central bank on earth cut interest rates in order to help Britain? Why did the decision made in 1927 matter more than the decision made in the panic of 1929? And why have so many historians, for almost 100 years, told the story backwards? By the spring of 1929, the warnings had already arrived in numbers too large to ignore. Margin debt, the borrowings members of the public used to buy single shares on installment, had risen to roughly $22 billion by the end of September 1929, an amount equal to nearly 3% of gross domestic product, a level modern researchers such as Karl Borowiecki have compared to the leverage ratios seen only at the peaks of later manias. In June, the economist Irving Fisher, one of the most respected figures in America, told the press that stocks were only a little higher than their ultimate plateau. On October 15, 1929, just 13 days before the collapse and a little under 2 weeks before Black Monday, Fisher wrote to the New York Times that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. The same week, John Maynard Keynes, Fisher's British rival, the man who had warned against Britain's return to gold 4 years earlier, was writing privately that the position is becoming insane. Investment trusts, those closed-end pools of borrowed money used to bet on more stocks, had multiplied like mushrooms in August rain, their asset values marked by insiders with little oversight, and their corporate charters written in a deliberately uncommercial English. The Dow's rise from 63 in August 1921 to 381 in September 1929 represented, on paper, a six-fold gain, and the average margin buyer had not the faintest idea that he was riding a borrowed horse. Margin loans from brokers and dealers alone accounted for more than 10% of the market value of common shares listed on the New York Stock Exchange. By mid-1929, call money, the overnight rate charged on speculative loans, opened the morning of October 24th at 12% and was bid above 20% by noon. Of all the numbers, there are dozens, and I will not pretend otherwise. The ones to remember are these. From peak in September 1929 to trough in July 1932, the Dow lost roughly 89% of its value. The economy lost about a third of its real output. And the banking system, which in October 1929 still stood largely intact, was annihilated across 4 waves of panic between 1930 and 1933, with 5,000 banks alone failing in 1931 and 4,000 more failing in 1932. To understand where that gasoline came from, you have to know the man who poured it. Benjamin Strong, Jr., was born in 1872 in an imposing house on the family estate in Fishkill-on-Hudson, New York. His father had worked under Treasury Secretary John Sherman in the 1880s. His grandfather, Benjamin Strong, Sr., had once run a successful private bank. Young Benjamin studied at Hackettstown in the New York society of the late 19th century, learned his manners in the drawing rooms of an older America, and entered banking as the family trade. By 1914, when the Federal Reserve System opened its doors for the first time, Strong was the obvious candidate to run the New York branch. He was tall, reserved, balding early, fond of British tailoring, and famous for a single trick of state. He could pick up the telephone, speak softly to his opposite number across the Atlantic, and move markets. His close collaborator, Montagu Norman, was his opposite in almost every respect: nervous, faintly eccentric, given to vegetarianism and unannounced disappearances into remote English country houses for weeks at a time. But they spoke, in Liaquat Ahemed's phrase, the same private language. Ahemed's Lords of Finance, published in 2009, and largely responsible for putting Strong and Norman back on the popular map, treats the two men as twin architects of an experiment that did not survive the decade. Strong suffered from poor health through the late 1920s. He was treated by a doctor in Georgia for what was then described as general exhaustion. He took long winter vacations in Florida. The fatigue he felt was probably tuberculosis, though the diagnosis was kept quiet in the press of the era. And yet, more than almost anyone alive, Strong knew what the discount rate could do when loosened. What Strong did not know, in the summer of 1927, was how much political courage he had left to spend. A central banker who is willing to be unpopular at home is rare. A central banker willing to be unpopular at home for the sake of a foreign pound is rarer still, and Strong was about to become one. Now the dinner. The meeting of July 1927 took place at the home of a New York Fed director at a private estate on Long Island. The guests included Strong, Norman, H. Jalmer Schacht, then president of the Reichsbank, who would much later become the head of Hitler's central bank, and Charles Rist, deputy governor of the Banque de France. The agenda in public was European stabilization. The reality, as the strong papers reveal, was a polite panic over the franc's relative strength and Britain's relative weakness. France had accumulated gold aggressively since the mid-1920s, partly to enforce the war reparations that Germany owed to Britain and the United States under the terms of what was supposed to be a new European equilibrium. France had little incentive to spend that gold in the wider world, and instead moved it into her central bank's vault and waited. The effect, in a world on a gold exchange standard, was to starve everyone else of liquidity. To relieve the pressure, Strong agreed to do two things. First, the New York Fed would buy securities on the open market, more boldly than before, pumping dollars into the global market. Second, by the 5th of August 1927, the New York Fed cut its discount rate from 4% to 3.5%. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, initially cautious, eventually followed. By the end of the year, America's basic short-term rate sat in the basement. Strong wrote, in a letter preserved in his papers, that the policy was intended to ease credit for the benefit of the farmer and the exporter. That letter survives. It is, as Stephen Roberts of the Richmond Fed later wrote in the spring of 2000, classic Strong, the domestic excuse written for political cover, the international motive left unsaid. The St. Louis Fed's archival collection holds the August letters in Strong's own hand. He did not tell Washington the real reason. He did not need to. Within 9 months of the Long Island dinner, the speculative bid in U.S. equities had begun in earnest, and Benjamin Strong, the most respected central banker alive, had lit it on purpose. In another country, in another dining room, in April 1925, a different dinner had ended differently. Winston Churchill had become Chancellor of the Exchequer the previous year, and almost immediately came under pressure from Montagu Norman to restore the pound sterling to its pre-war parity with gold. Norman believed, with the ferocious calm of the European central banking class, that British financial credibility required the pound to be worth what it had been worth in 1913, roughly $4.86. Before announcing the decision, Churchill wrote to John Maynard Keynes, then a Cambridge don of moderate fame, and asked whether he foresaw trouble. Keynes replied with a memorandum in March 1925. The pound was overvalued, he wrote. Members of the export trades would lose their markets. Unemployment would rise. The only people who would gain were the rentiers, the lenders, the creditors, the noble old men with gilt portfolios who received their coupons in pounds and could now buy summer houses in Tuscany. The Treasury, the Bank of England, and Norman above all, overruled him. In April, Churchill made the announcement. By the end of the year, British unemployment had begun to climb. By 1926, the general strike erupted. Though the strike itself was a temporary rupture kept within weeks, the more durable rupture was the slow loss of markets. By 1929, British industry was sluggish in a way American industry was not. Keynes published his protest as The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill in 1925. The title was meant to sting. It still does. What Churchill did not say in public, what Norman did not say in private, and what Strong certainly understood when he took the call from London in July 1927, was this. Britain's decision in 1925 would, in 2 short years, force America's decision in 1927, which would in turn turn America's brokers into the biggest obligor of the second half of the decade. The thread ran from London through New York to the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Most histories read it backwards. The cause of America's bubble, it turns out, was partly Britain's pride. Here is the contradiction that must be confronted. The Federal Reserve, between January and July 1928, raised the discount rate from 3.5% to 5% specifically. by the San Francisco Fed's own later reckoning, to slow the speculation that its own 1927 cuts had helped to ignite. Strong opposed the move. He wrote to colleagues at the Reserve Board arguing that raising rates would injure ordinary farmers and ordinary exporters who had nothing to do with the broker's casino. The Reserve Board raised rates anyway. The market kept climbing. Call money in New York touched 10% in early 1929 and stayed there for months. And yet, and this is the part historians so often smooth over, the 1928 tightening did not stop the speculation. It changed it. Higher rates did not break the speculator's nerve. They broke the small speculator's nerve. They pushed margin borrowing from the trusted private banks into the investment trusts, the newly invented holding companies whose job was to pool borrowed money and buy more stocks. Anna Jacobson Schwartz, Milton Friedman's co-author, later demonstrated in A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. A book that, when it finally appeared in 1963, would not get serious attention for another 20 years, that the structure of the speculative shock mattered more than its size. The lesson, in a line, is this. The Federal Reserve in 1927 did not invent the mania by itself, but in 1928 and 1929, by tightening too late and at the wrong nodes, it allowed a manageable speculative excess to harden into a system-wide credit structure that could not come down without collapse. The policy that helped start the fire and the policy that failed to put it out were almost the same policy, separated by 12 months and a handful of reluctant signatures. The crash itself, when it came, was a spectacle unequaled even by the standards of the era. The morning of October 24, 1929, opened with a record 12.25 million shares changing hands before the closing bell. By noon, an attempted rescue was underway. Charles Mitchell, the head of National City Bank, gathered a pool of New York's leading bankers and agreed above the chaos of the floor to buy large blocks of blue-chip stocks at above-market prices, a gesture intended to reassure the public that solid men were standing behind the market. John Kenneth Galbraith later described the pool, in The Great Crash, 1929, as the very embodiment of the era's terminal self-confidence. Mitchell's bank had, by that October, been selling mortgage bonds and equity trust certificates to its depositors for almost 2 years, products that transformed its small-town branch offices into mini brokerage houses, with consequences Mitchell's directors seem not to have understood. The rally of October 24 faded by the close. Monday the 20th, Black Monday, took the Dow down another 13%. Tuesday the 29th, Black Tuesday, took the index down another 12 and finished the month with the Dow at 198, a fall of 183 points from its September peak, on a single index, in a single quarter. 16 million shares changed hands that day. Margin clerks did not sleep. Toward the end of October, in certain brokerage back rooms along Broad Street, junior partners drafted letters to their wives that they never sent, and the more honest among them wrote out, by hand, lists of clients they knew would commit suicide. The aftermath is what most so-called explanations of the crash still get most badly wrong. The crash of October 1929 alone did not produce the Great Depression. The crash of October 1929 produced the most acute financial shock of the century, yes. It produced a sharp but not catastrophic recession, yes. But by the end of 1930, the banking system was still largely standing. The inflection came afterward. In December 1930, the Bank of United States, a private bank on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, founded by a Brooklyn immigrant named Joseph S. Marcus, suspended operations. It held at the time roughly $238 million in deposits, a sum that made it the largest bank failure in American history up to that moment, and a sum that emptied the savings of a population, largely working class, largely immigrant, whose members had done absolutely nothing to bring it on. In the weeks that followed, bank runs began in earnest, and in their wake, the the Federal Reserve's own index of the money supply began to fall. By 1933, roughly 9,000 of the United States' 25,000 banks had vanished. Real gross national product would fall, by the broadest available measures, by roughly 30%. Wholesale prices fell by a third. Consumer prices fell by a quarter. 14 million Americans were out of work in 1933, 1/4 of the entire civilian labor force, a population roughly the size of modern Spain. International trade collapsed. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of June 1930 raised the average U.S. duty on dutiable imports to nearly 60%, a move that, as Dartmouth's Douglas Irwin demonstrated in a quantitative assessment published in 1998, can be plausibly credited with a 48% drop in U.S. imports directly attributable to the act itself, and more significantly, with a much larger drop attributable to the retaliation it invited. World trade fell by roughly 2/3 between 1929 and 1934. The economic literature still debates, as it has for almost a century, how much of the catastrophe belongs to the Federal Reserve, how much to the tariff, how much to overseas shocks from the gold bloc, particularly France. What it does not debate is the human scale. Men who had been clerks in 1929 stood in bread lines in 1932. Children who had been born in prosperity died of malnutrition in 1933. The memory of those years was long, and it stayed in American bones for a generation. That memory ended up lodged, decades later, in the thinking of a boy born in Augusta, Georgia, in 1953, Ben Bernanke, who would grow up to chair the Federal Reserve. On the 2nd of March 2004, in the banquet room of a Virginia college named for a long-forgotten monetary reformer, Bernanke delivered a lecture he called Money, Gold, and the Great Depression. The text is now online at the Federal Reserve's own website, and it is worth reading in full. In it, Bernanke did a careful thing. He confirmed Friedman and Schwartz mostly. He pushed the Friedmanian thesis harder than Friedman himself had. And he apologized, on his institution's behalf, in the most measured language the Fed has ever managed to put on one of its own. The Federal Reserve in the early 1930s, he said, had allowed the money supply to fall by roughly a third because of waves of banking panic that the Reserve had the legal and practical power to offset, but did not. The Fed's failure, in Bernanke's framing and Bernanke's views on this, are essentially the bureaucratic views of the Fed as it currently exists, was the proximate cause of the Depression becoming great rather than merely severe. The same speech is now required reading at the New York Fed. It is also instructive because it places 1929 in proper proportion. The crash, in Bernanke's frame, was the trigger. The bank's response was the bullet. The trigger and the bullet are two different things, and most popular accounts erase the difference in a single sentence. I want to be careful here, because at this distance the temptation to overstate the story is enormous. The 30s mythology in the popular telling runs like this. A handful of wicked men in top hats sat at a private dinner, decided to bet the country's working class against the wall, and walked away richer. There are good reasons to push back on that telling. First, Benjamin Strong was not a speculator. He was a public official attempting to solve a genuine international problem, and he did it with the tools he had been trained to use. His error, if it was his, was a misjudgment that hundreds of trained economists have spent 100 years debating, not a conspiracy. Second, Montagu Norman's pressure on Churchill to return to gold at parity was wrong, but it was out of conviction, and would not be settled finally until the British themselves abandoned gold in 1931, after a brief attempt under Ramsay MacDonald's national government to defend parity at all costs. Third, even within the Federal Reserve, the rate tightening of 1928 was driven by a sincere recognition that the speculation was real, and the moral hazard that came with it could destabilize the system. The people who made the calls were not unanimous, and that is exactly what makes the story historically plausible. Fourth, Irving Fisher's permanently high plateau prediction was made, in good faith, by a serious economist working with the tools he had, with no special malign intent. Within days of his remark, his own net worth was largely wiped out, though he had the misfortune to die in 1947 without ever seeing the index return to the level he had described as permanent. And fifth, the American banking collapse of 1930 to 1933 was, by every careful count we now have, exacerbated by both the Smoot-Hawley tariff, by the international gold crisis triggered by France's continued hoarding, and by a string of bank-specific failures across the Mississippi Valley and the agricultural Middle West, whose proximate causes had nothing to do with Wall Street at all. The error of the 1820s and 30s, then, is not that the villains caused everything. It is that the policies of honest, well-meaning men, executed through reputable institutions, produced a catastrophe no one intended. That is the more frightening version. The conspiratorial version at least has someone to blame. The sober version requires accepting that the consensus of serious men can fail in slow motion. The careful work of Galbraith, Friedman and Schwartz, Ahamed, Green and Bernanke all converge on the same basic point, even when they disagree about emphasis. The crash of 1929 was not, in Galbraith's phrase, an unforeseeable thunderbolt. The crash of 1929 was the visible quarter of an iceberg, whose mass had been growing steadily under the surface for 4 years, and had been demonstrably pushed down by decisions taken in Marble Arch, in Baltimore, and in Washington. Gold flowed or did not flow. Dinners took place or did not take place. Discount rates changed by halves of percent, and the world changed with them. And the most damning part of the story is that no single official of any institution survived the decade willing to say, on the record, what he had done wrong. Andrew Mellon, then Secretary of the Treasury, is reported in Hoover's own 1952 memoirs to have urged the president to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Although, as serious later readers of Hoover's prose have pointed out, the precise four-clause phrasing is unusual enough that it may be Hoover's own literary reconstruction rather than a verbatim quote. Either way, Hoover believed his Treasury Secretary believed in letting the markets clear. The markets never cleared. They crashed. They then crashed again. And then again. What I think every viewer owes to the story, finally, is this. Power in finance has a peculiar property. It does not have to be evil to break things. It only has to be confident, technical, and ignored. The bankers of 1927 were confident. The economists of 1928 were technical. The public of 1929 was, finally, ignored. The Federal Reserve of the early 1930s had, by Bernanke's own admission in 2004, refused to use the instruments at its disposal to defend its own currency, because to do so would have required the kind of creative intervention that, in 1932, would have looked absurd to men of that era. The lesson is not that capitalism failed. The lesson is that capitalism, left to a small circle of confident men at lunch, sometimes does fail in slow motion, in the calmest language imaginable, in documents sealed for decades. What looks like a single crash is, almost always, a long unraveling. What looks like a single villain is almost always an institution that has chosen, gently, through ordinary reasoning, to do what it was designed to do. The strongest version of this story is the one where nobody, in particular, did anything wrong, and yet the result was a decade of mass unemployment and a debt that took decades to pay. Anyone who promises you a single neat explanation for the crash of 1929 is selling you a story shaped by the size of the only model they have, and the model is smaller than the world. If you want to dive deeper, try this. Look up the Strong papers digitized at the Federal Reserve Archive in St. Louis, well worth an evening of your time. Pick any one letter between Strong and Norman in 1927 and read the language. Try Galbraith's Great Crash. 1929 for the popular synthesis. And then, with that in hand, move to Friedman and Schwartz's A Monetary History and Bernanke's 2004 lecture for the academic riposte. Try Liaquat Ahemed's Lords of Finance for the central bankers themselves, and Barry Eichengreen's Golden Fetters for the international strand. The more you read, the more the picture blurs in a useful way, and the more it becomes impossible to blame any single person. That is the work of the documentary, and it is the work of honest memory. If this changed your picture of the crash, leave the keyword Norman in the comments after the dust has settled, and tell me one thing you have always believed about 1929 that you are no longer sure is right. Subscribe and we will pick up the next one in this series. The 20s are not yet done.